Imagine walking into a room and every person in that room instantly falls silent. Not out of fear, not out of politeness, but because something about your presence is so undeniably powerful that words simply stop working. That is what happened, repeatedly, when Jesus of Nazareth walked into a room. For centuries, theologians and believers have described this phenomenon through the language of faith. But something remarkable has been happening in the last several decades. Scientists, neurologists, historians, and archaeologists, people trained to question everything, have been studying the documented accounts of Jesus entering rooms, speaking to crowds, and interacting with individuals. And what they have found has left many of them without easy answers. Tonight, we are going to walk through what actually happened in those moments. We are going to look at the historical records, the scientific attempts to explain them, and the testimonies of people in the first century who witnessed something they could not explain. And by the end of this video, you will understand why the moment Jesus walked into a room was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen, and why modern science still cannot fully account for it. What the historical record says before we look at the science. We need to understand what the ancient sources actually say. The Gospel accounts, written within living memory of the events they describe, contain dozens of descriptions of Jesus entering spaces and producing an immediate, measurable effect on everyone present. In the synagogue at Capernaum, described in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus walked in and began to teach. The text says the people were astounded at his teaching, not because of the content alone, but because he taught as one who had authority. This was a specific observation about presence, not just content. The original Greek word used is exousia, a term that means inherent power or delegated authority. It was not a word used casually. In the same synagogue visit, a man with an unclean spirit cried out. What is remarkable is not just what the spirit said, but the timing. The moment Jesus entered and spoke, something responded. Something in the room shifted. Witnesses left that synagogue and spread the account immediately through the entire surrounding region. This pattern repeats throughout the gospel accounts. Jesus walks into a space, a house, a temple court, a hillside, a fishing boat, and the atmosphere changes. People stop what they are doing, arguments cease, the sick are drawn toward him, the proud become uncomfortable, the humble become courageous. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing about the early Christians and their founder, acknowledged that Jesus had been executed under Pontius Pilate, but that his movement had continued to spread. A movement built on the testimony of people who claimed to have witnessed something real. The Jewish historian Josephus also referenced Jesus and noted the unusual devotion of those who followed him. These are not internal religious documents. These are external historical sources, acknowledging that something about this person produced an effect that outlasted his physical presence and spread beyond the region where he lived. The neuroscience of present modern neuroscience has spent decades studying what researchers call social presence, the measurable effect one person has on the emotional and physiological state of others simply by being in the same space. What they have discovered is that human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to the presence of other people. We register threat, authority, warmth, and power through mechanisms that operate far below conscious thought. The vagus nerve, one of the longest nerves in the human body, acts as a communication highway between the brain and the body. When we encounter a person who radiates genuine safety, compassion, and authority, the vagus nerve responds. Heart rate changes, breathing slows, cortisol levels drop. The body literally enters a different physiological state. Researchers studying what they call limbic resonance have found that the emotional states of one person can directly influence the emotional states of those around them. This is not metaphor. It is measurable neurological reality. When someone who is completely regulated, calm, and centered enters a room of anxious or distressed people, the group's collective nervous system begins to shift. Now consider what the gospel accounts describe. A man who never appears flustered, who sleeps through a storm that terrifies experienced fishermen, who faces crowds threatening to stone him and walks through them calmly. who stands before Pontius Pilate, the most powerful political authority in the region, without anxiety. Every account from every source describes Jesus as someone who was completely, consistently, and inexplicably at peace. Neuroscientists studying the accounts have noted something striking. The descriptions of what happened when Jesus entered spaces match almost precisely what we now know happens when a profoundly regulated, deeply centered individual enters a group setting. The anxious become calm, the silent find words, the physically suffering report change, the proud feel exposed. These are not random effects. These are the documented physiological responses to an encounter with someone operating at a level of nervous system regulation that most humans never reach. The cases science cannot explain, but presence alone does not account for everything, because the gospel accounts also describe something else. They describe instantaneous physical healings, blindness reversed, paralysis ended, fever broken in a moment, a man dead for 4 days walking out of a tomb. Medical historians have analyzed these accounts carefully, and what they have found is not the embellished mythology of a religious propaganda campaign. What they have found are clinically specific descriptions. The blind man in John 9 describes his visual experience after healing in terms that match what ophthalmologists now know about the stages of sight restoration. The 10 lepers described in Luke 17 are told to show themselves to the priests, a specific instruction rooted in the Levitical purity laws that required priestly inspection before a person could be declared clean. These are not the details that get added to legends over time. These are the details that get stripped out. Neurologist Dr. Pierre Barbet spent years analyzing the Shroud of Turin, the burial cloth that some believe was wrapped around the body of Jesus. What he found matched in precise anatomical detail every aspect of Roman crucifixion as we now know it from archaeology. The nail placement, the blood flow patterns, the trauma to the wrists. In 1931, when Barbet was conducting his analysis, some of this archaeological knowledge did not yet exist. The details in the cloth were ahead of the science used to analyze them. None of this constitutes scientific proof of the resurrection, but it constitutes something significant. It constitutes evidence that the accounts surrounding Jesus of Nazareth contain a level of historical and medical specificity that is inconsistent with legend and very consistent with testimony. What happened in the upper room, perhaps the most studied single-room encounter in the Jesus narrative, is what happened 50 days after the crucifixion, in a room in Jerusalem. The account in Acts chapter 2 describes approximately 120 people gathered in a room. Then something happened that the witnesses described as a sound like a rushing, violent wind filling the entire house. Then what appeared to be tongues of fire resting on each person. Then every person in the room began speaking in languages they had never learned. Pilgrims from at least 15 different named regions and language groups were gathered in Jerusalem for the Festival of Weeks. The text specifies the regions: Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, Cretans, and Arabs. Each group heard their own language being spoken by people who had no knowledge of it. Linguists studying this account have noted that what is described is not ecstatic speech, glossolalia as it is technically known, but xenolalia, speaking in known, identifiable human languages that the speaker has never learned. These are categorically different phenomena. Glossolalia is well documented across cultures and can be explained through neurological mechanisms. Xenolalia, documented, verified speaking of unknown foreign languages, has no naturalistic explanation. The crowd that gathered to witness this event numbered in the thousands, and on a single day, 3,000 people were added to the community of those who believed, not because of a sermon alone, because something had happened in a room that could not be explained by any category available to first-century observers, and still cannot be fully explained by the categories available to 21st century scientists. The testimony that changed the world here is what the historians keep coming back to. The movement that began in that upper room in Jerusalem spread with a speed and durability that has no parallel in human history. Within 300 years, it had reached every corner of the Roman Empire and beyond. Within 500 years, it was the dominant spiritual framework of Western civilization. Today, after 2,000 years, it remains the largest religious movement on earth, with over 2 billion adherents. The people who started this movement were not powerful. They were not wealthy. They did not have armies or political authority. They were fishermen, tax collectors, former prostitutes, tent makers, and former members of the very council that had condemned their leader to death. What they had was testimony, personal, specific, costly testimony about what they had seen, heard, and touched. 11 of the 12 original disciples died for that testimony, not for a belief, not for a philosophy, for the specific claim that they had seen a man who was killed come back to life, speak with them, eat with them, and then ascend physically out of their sight. People die for beliefs, but the pattern of dying for the specific empirical claim that you personally witnessed a dead man alive again is a different category entirely. The historian N.T. Wright, after spending years analyzing the resurrection accounts using the same historical methodology applied to any other ancient claim, concluded that the bodily resurrection of Jesus is the most historically defensible explanation for the origin of the early Christian movement. This is not a theologian looking for confirmation. This is a historian following the evidence to its most coherent conclusion. When Jesus walked into a room, something happened. The historical record is unambiguous on this point. People were changed, the sick were healed, the proud were humbled, the broken were restored, the dead were raised. And a movement started that has never stopped. Science has given us extraordinary tools for understanding the world. But there are doors that empirical method cannot open, not because science is wrong, but because some realities are not accessible through the instruments of measurement we have invented. The presence of Jesus in a room was one of those realities. The scientists who have studied these accounts most carefully are not the ones who have walked away most confident. They are the ones who have walked away most quiet. Because when you follow the evidence honestly, you eventually arrive at a door that none of your tools can open, and the only thing left is to knock. If this video helped you understand something about the historical Jesus that you had never considered before, subscribe to this channel. We are going to keep going deeper into the rooms, the moments, the documents, and the discoveries that keep making this the most remarkable story ever told.